but it depends on the organization.
The outsourcing policy sits outside of procurement, in a sense, with the jointly owned by the CFO and the COO.
Right.
So the idea of that layer.
Okay, so there's a layer of policy sitting with the chief financial officer and the chief operating officer, and did they oversee your activities?
When it's an outsourcing, they do have to report to them on a regular basis.
Okay, and I think that that's an acknowledgement, the involvement of senior executives elsewhere, recognizing the importance, especially of a bona fide outsourcing. And outsourcing is such a commonly used term. When I say outsourcing, I mean something that is integral to the base operations of your company. So if you're a company, if you've outsourced, say, guard services or facilities management, that may not be core, that may not be sort of a traditional outsourcing, but if you've got something that your customers would recognize as you providing the service, either your customers or employees, that to me is really outsourcing. And that means that they're actually part of your company. It's just the performance of that activity is being performed elsewhere. So that's a different relationship. And does that extend beyond outsourcing, or is it limited to that?
Both.
Okay.
We're more interested in the outsourcing agreements because of our financial obligations.
Right.
So our regulatory obligations.
Okay, so you have regulatory oversight, and that's another way to get governance in. The regulatory oversight that is inherent in regulated industries, pharmaceuticals, financial services, et cetera, insurance, there are regulators who will come and look at it. Now, it's not as heavy-handed in Canada as some other countries, and so that maybe is not as such a case for change, but clearly we're all regulated.
We're listed on the London Stock Exchange.
Okay, so if you're listed in another jurisdiction, then you'll have regulators that will oversee this. And that's actually, if you've done it simply because there's a regulator, you may not have the most robust program. It's very important that your executives understand that you're really actually trying to manage risk, because that's all the regulators care about, is are you running your company properly. So is there anybody else in the room that has a fairly robust program? So do you feel, I guess another question, do you feel that you're managing risk well? Yes? Is there anybody who has concerns about that? So I'm talking about the supplier risk, whether or not they become insolvent and fail, whether they fail to perform, whether they're going to have security breaches, those types of things, and whether they'll exist. Yep.
I would caveat what I said. I run two functions. I run an indirect procurement team.
Right.
And a supply team that manages claims.
Yes. So the claim side is probably covered.
The claim side is better because we sit within the operation.
Right.
So all ends of the service report into the EVP compliance.
Right.
Where I have less comfort is in the indirect space where we're providing services to different EVPs.
Mm-hmm.
So unless we sit in each of those business lines and report it, the level of focus once the contract is signed on, maintaining and enhancing the value of the contract, the technological.
And I think that's really characteristic, that unless there's a compelling reason to look at managing it. So what I'd like to do is make a case today to say it's something that you might actually want to add to your span of control and the responsibilities that you have, because I really do believe there's value in it. So when you think about it, there's different types of relationships, and they all go through a life cycle. You go through origination, you go through a governance process, and you go through termination. I would suggest that during the origination phase, which is you're going through an RFP or some sort of competitive bid, and you're making the selection decision, I would suggest that most organizations are very satisfied with their ability to execute that process well. So where it starts to fall down, though, is usually you're so busy and you have so many things at hand, and it's not a burning platform for the organization. By the time you get into steady state and it's ongoing, a lot of these relationships are managed elsewhere in the business. Once it gets out in the business, it's a little bit invisible to you. So whether or not there is a problem coming or problem looming, or they're performing according to what the contract says, or whether things are migrating into a new direction, et cetera, most organizations just don't have any visibility in there, and nor do they have a standard set of frameworks that enable the business to manage well. So I'm really in favor of a center-led view of that, because this is out in the business. So how can you help them do the best job possible of the risk management function that really is inherent in their jobs now? And then also, I think there's a little more visibility when you get into termination, because people are starting to realize the risks exist when you start to change suppliers or end a relationship. But even that is usually sort of the path less well traveled. So what you really want to have is visibility in the early warning system, and certainly from the C-suite level, that's what I hear they're looking for. So especially if you have an integral outsourcer who's really providing some support to some aspect of your business, if in fact you have no early warning signal that there's something happening, then you could find yourself in a really difficult spot. So either their service performance starts to deteriorate, or heaven forbid, they end up sort of showing up one day in Chapter 11 and you're not able to get services. And this is really what is making the senior executives sweat, it makes your auditor sweat, and I bet you it's making you sweat from time to time. So the problem is that trying to get some sort of reasonableness into this is the most difficult part. So you probably have thousands of suppliers, and quite truthfully, you don't need a robust governance program across all of them. But the 80-20 rule probably exists, and if you start there figuring out what's in scope and what are you going to actually address, and convincing others who think it's important that not everything that you deal with is important. You really want to get sort of the higher risk relationships. You need to find a way to identify them and a way to manage them and a way to govern them. So figuring out what's in scope, there's some fairly simple tests that you can put in place. One is really that, is it really an outsourcing, for example? Do they have access to regulated information or regulated materials? So if you're subject to HIPAA or PIPEDA, or you have customer information, et cetera, those types of things sort of, they come a check mark right away, because as suppliers start to have problems in their own situation, whether they're letting people go and they're downsizing, they're trying to cut costs, what I'm also seeing is a great rise in information security breaches. And that's another thing that's getting a lot of attention. So what's in scope and why is it there? How are you going to lay out a process so that it's not burdensome for the organization? Because if it is, and it just creates a lot of noise, they're probably not going to follow it anyways. And then who is responsible for what? So you're going to have some things that have this governance layer. Maybe it's not in your own organization. Maybe it's in a risk management group or the COO or the CFO's group. You've got the procurement people, and you've got the business people, and you've got your supplier community. So you need to sort of sort it out, who's going to manage this, and what are the policies and practices. And then you probably need some form of technology and behind that, and a data warehouse, because it's pretty hard to manage all the moving parts if you don't have some at least modest investment in technology. So I was quite interested this morning listening to Robert. It's really think about that, start with an end in mind. So you want to also think about your actual relationships themselves, and you're right down to the individual relationship risk management. So you want to think through sort of, all things will end. And if you've thought all these things through right from the beginning in terms of, what level of cooperation you can have throughout and at the end of the relationship, make sure that as you have an ongoing relationship, when you get into a contract, sometimes they store data that you have to have access to at a later date, either ongoing or if things are starting to melt down. If you're in a situation where there's a meltdown or there is a termination, the data format, it may or may not be usable. And I remember learning this quite a number of years ago, where I went in, I was working with a bank, and they had their entire forms library was on some, number one, the supplier owned the artwork. I mean, that's quite phenomenal to me. And number two, they didn't have it in a usable format. So that meant everything was in PDF, and in fact they were in Meltdown, which is how I got involved in it. And so we would have had to recreate all of those forms, which is just a bit of a nightmare. I mean, banks live on forms, right? So anyhow, so the format of the data is really important. So we were going through and trying to fix this up. Access to assets, and that's people too. So if you think about it, basically, if you've outsourced or you're dealing with a supplier that might be in some sort of trouble, you probably have provisions in your contract that say that you can never hire their people, you can never bring back the people you might have outsourced. And I would suggest now's the time to change those clauses to say under certain circumstances that's null and void, because if you're in there first and you know what's going on, you may have the access to the best resources available if in fact that supplier is not going to continue. Can you get in their facilities? You know, licensing costs as things moved over. Who owns intellectual property? That's such a hot topic. If they've developed things with you and for you, do you even own the rights to them that you can continue? Have they documented things?